This came through the USPS forward chain to our firm address. It's addressed to a David Castellano at 4 Serrano Court. And the return label is your mother's Scottsdale address, which means either she sold your house or she's forwarding mail for strangers. Talia set the envelope on Petra's keyboard at 4:47 p.m. and did not move from the doorway. The overhead lights in the Hartwell and Odom bullpen had already cycled into their evening dimming, and the office had thinned to the handful of people who stayed past 4 on Thursdays. A deposition to prep, a filing deadline, the specific, grinding quiet of end-of-week catch-up work that could not wait until Monday. Petra had been reviewing a real property title chain for the Marchetti matter and had a red pen in her right hand and a highlighter cap between her teeth when Talia dropped the envelope and said what she said. Petra took the highlighter cap out of her mouth. She looked at the envelope. It was a standard number 10 white with a plastic window on the lower left quadrant. The words visible through the window read, David Castellano, or current resident. The address below that was 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, a Z85718. She had grown up at 4 Serrano Court. She had lived there from age 3 until she left for the University of Arizona at 18. And she had come back during summers. And she had come back the week Roberto died, in June of 2021, and she had not been back since. The mortgage had been paid off in 2019. The property taxes were due in 2 installments each year, and her father had always paid them the first week of October and the first week of March. And after he died, her mother had continued that practice. And Petra knew this because she had asked once in the fall of 2021. And Dolores had said, I manage this house the way I have always managed this house. She had accepted that and stopped asking. The return address in the upper left corner of the envelope was printed in a standard sans serif font on a white adhesive label. It read, D. Vasquez, 7740A, Camelback Road, Unit 214, Scottsdale, Aza 85251. Petra did not know that address. She looked at the forwarding labels. There were 3 of them, stacked, each one partially covering the one beneath it the way palimpsest works. Each layer partially legible. Each one a record of somewhere the envelope had already been. The bottom label, had sent it first to the Scottsdale address. The middle label had sent it from there to her apartment on 6th Avenue in the Rincon Heights neighborhood, where she'd been renting for 4 years. The top label had rerouted it from the apartment to 220 East, Congress Street, Suite 400, Hartwell and Odom's address, because she had listed the firm as her USPS mail contact during a 9-month sublet in 2024, when she had been staying with a friend in Albuquerque while the apartment underwent mold remediation. And she had never updated the system afterward. She knew exactly why the envelope had come here. The postal infrastructure had done what postal infrastructure does. It had followed the chain of forwarding addresses until it found a live one, and the live one had been this desk. What she did not yet want to assemble was what the chain meant. Petra! Talia was still in the doorway. She was 34, 4 years younger than Petra, with dark circles under her eyes that came and went based on whether she'd had a trial week. And she was watching Petra with the expression she used when she already knew the answer to the question she was about to ask. Do you want me to stay? No! Petra turned the envelope over. No additional markings on the back. Verkmin sealed with the standard gummed flap, not taped. Capital One's logo was printed on the upper right corner of the front. A small red boomerang shape. The pre-screen text printed below the address window read, "You may be pre-approved. Respond by June 15th, 2026. I'm fine. Thank you for bringing it over." Talia did not move for 3 more seconds. Then she said, "I'll be at my desk until 6, and pulled the door partly closed behind her. Petra set the envelope on the desk next to her mouse pad and looked at it. A Capital One pre-screen credit offer for someone named David Castellano, sent to the address of the house her father had left to her, and her mother jointly under the terms of a will that, to the best of Petra's knowledge, had never been superseded or revoked. A pre-screen offer meant Castellano had an established credit profile at that address, which meant he had been resident there long enough for the credit bureaus to associate his name with the property, which meant he had not just moved in, which meant the transaction that produced his tenancy had not happened recently. She had not been back to Serrano Court since the summer of 2021. The return address, 7740 East, Camelback Road, Unit 214, Scottsdale, was her mother's address. She was almost certain of this. She had the number her mother called from, a 520 area code, and she had the fact that her mother had mentioned, in a phone call sometime in the winter, February, Petra thought, or possibly January, that she had been thinking about spending more time in Scottsdale. She had not said she was moving. She had said, thinking about. Petra opened the desk drawer to her left and took out a fresh legal pad. She uncapped her pen. She wrote in her standard block print, 4 Serrano Court. Then below that, de Vasquez, 7740E, Camelback, Scottsdale. Then D Castellano. Then received at H&O, May 19th, 2026. She looked at the date she had just written, May 19th, 2026. She uncapped her highlighter and drew a yellow line under it. The thing she was not yet naming operated like this. If David Castellano was a current resident at 4 Serrano Court, and the mail being forwarded to a Scottsdale address under her mother's name was going to Unit 214 at a building on Camelback Road, then her mother was not at 4 Serrano Court. And if her mother was not at 4 Serrano Court, and someone named Castellano was, then either her mother had rented the property, possible, legally ambiguous, without Petra's consent, but possible, or her mother had conveyed it. To convey it, she would have needed to execute a grant deed. To execute a grant deed on a property with joint beneficiary interests under an open probate estate, she would have needed either Petra's signature or a court order. Petra had signed nothing. No court had contacted her. She wrote, "Conveyance without consent of co-beneficiary." Then below that, check Pima County Recorder. She set the pen down. Roberto Vasquez had died on June 14th, 2021, a Wednesday, in the cardiac ICU at Banner University Medical Center at 11:49 in the morning, with Dolores on his left side and Petra on his right. He had been 68 years old. He had worked as a structural engineer for 31 years and had been retired for 7. He had bought 4 Serrano Court in the spring of 1993 for $147,000 when Petra was 3 years old and the neighborhood was still transitional. And he had maintained it with the precision he applied to everything structural. The roof replaced in 2006. The HVAC in 2014. The plumbing rerouted in 2017 after a slow leak behind the kitchen wall that he had found by following a hairline moisture stain for 6 weeks before confirming the source. He had not been a man who let things slide. He had filed a will with Pima County Probate in 2018. Petra knew this because she had found the original in a Nike shoebox in the hallway closet 3 days after his death. And she had read it once, and she had filed what she thought were the relevant documents. And she had gone back to work 2 weeks later because the grief had nowhere else to go and the work was something she could do correctly. She had not followed up on the probate proceedings after that. She looked at the envelope on her desk. It was 4:53 p. She thought about the last time she had talked to her mother. 3 weeks ago. A Sunday? The call lasting 11 minutes. Dolores had mentioned that Rolando Mira. She had been with Rolando Mira for approximately a year and a half. He was a contractor, retired, living in Scottsdale. Petra had met him once at Christmas, was helping her sort through some things at the house. She had used the word sorting. She had said the place was getting to be too much. She had said Tucson in the summer was harder to take every year. Petra had said, "Are you thinking about renting it out?" Dolores had said, "I'm thinking about what makes sense." Petra had said, "If anything changes with the property, just let me know so I can..." Dolores had said, "I know how to manage my own house." Petra, she had said my house. Petra had registered this at the time and then set it aside. Because that was how Dolores talked about 4 Serrano Court. As her own domain, her own project, the thing she had overseen and maintained and organized for 28 years. And it had never before meant anything more than the habit of a woman who ran her household with complete authority and expected the term to be understood in the domestic rather than the legal sense. She picked up the envelope and turned it over again. The paper was slightly soft from having passed through multiple postal handling cycles. But the 3 forwarding labels were each a slightly different shade of white. Different printers. Different facilities. Slightly different timings. The Capital One Boomerang logo in the corner was printed in a red precise enough to read as urgent if you were not paying attention. She was not paying attention. She thought about the year Roberto bought the house. 1993. Petra had been 3. She had a memory, which she had never been able to verify and which might have been constructed from a photograph she had seen later, of a room that smelled like fresh paint and her father crouching down to her level and saying something she could not remember the words of. Only the register. Calm. Certain. The voice he used when he was telling her a thing was solid. She had always assumed the memory was of the house on Serrano Court. She had never asked. She set the envelope down a second time. 5:01 p.m. If the sale had closed recently, and the presence of pre-screen mail suggesting Castellano as a current resident, but with enough credit bureau lag to have been sent to the old address, implied it had closed within the last several weeks. Then the window for a legal response was not open indefinitely. She knew this the way she knew the mechanics of property transfer law, not from law school, but from 11 years of sitting beside attorneys who dealt with exactly this kind of problem and doing the research that made their arguments possible. Probate assets could be frozen. proceeds could be traced. A lis pendens could be filed against the proceeds if the sale itself had been unauthorized. But the proceeds had to be accessible. And if her mother's partner had a condo purchase in process, then accessible was a condition with an expiration date. She counted backward. If the pre-screen offer had been sent 2 to 3 weeks after the credit bureau update, and the bureau update typically lagged closing by 1 to 2 weeks, then the closing had happened 4 to 5 weeks ago at most, possibly less. She picked up the envelope a third time and held it. The pre-screen deadline was June 15th, 2026. That was 27 days from today. But that was the offer deadline, not useful to her. What was useful was the postmark, which she had not yet looked at. She turned the envelope horizontal. The postmark was stamped in the upper right quadrant, slightly off-center the way machine postmarks always were. May 14th, 2026. Tucson, Arizona. May 14th, 5 days ago. The closing, if it had happened before May 14th. The credit bureau update that triggered the pre-screen offer had happened before May 14th. The closing had happened before that. She was looking at a document that was already 10 to 20 days behind the event. It was the first evidence of... She set the envelope down and did not touch it again. 4 Serrano Court, $487,000 was what a property of that size, in that neighborhood, in that condition, was worth right now in a Tucson market that had been climbing for 3 years. She had not looked at the comps recently, but she had a working number in her head because she paid attention to property values the way she paid attention to most things connected to her father's estate. From a distance, as background data, not as active intelligence. Half of $487,000 was $243,500. Her father had left the house to both of them. That was what the will said. She had read it once in 2021 and filed it, and had spent 4 years treating it as a document rather than a position. She reached for her phone at 5:03 p.m. I pulled into the carport on 6th Avenue at 6:22 p.m. and did not go inside immediately. I sat in the car with the engine off and looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, where I had set it before leaving the parking structure at Hartwell and Odom, still sealed, still addressed to David Castellano, or current resident at 4 Serrano Court. I was 36 years old, and I had spent 11 years preparing real property documents for attorneys who got paid to notice exactly what I was now sitting in a car, not wanting to notice. I went inside. My apartment is a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that was renovated in 2019, and the renovation preserved the original tile work in the kitchen, which I like, and replaced the original windows with double-paned units that seal so tightly the room goes quiet when you close them. I closed them. I set my bag on the kitchen counter, set the envelope beside the bag, and opened my laptop. The Pima County Assessor's website loads in under 3 seconds on my connection. The Recorder's Office Public Document Portal loads in under 2. I had navigated both sites more times than I could count, searching deed chains for attorneys who needed to establish chain of title going back 20 or 30 years, finding recorded instruments on properties with contested ownership, pulling closing disclosures for cases that required confirmation of exactly when and for how much a piece of real property had transferred. I typed the address, 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, AZ 85718. the most recent recorded instrument populated at the top of the results list. It was a grant deed. The recording date was May 12th, 2026. The instrument date was May 8th, 2026. 4 days between execution and recording, standard. The grantor was listed as Dolores Esperanza Vasquez, a widow. The grantee was listed as David and Patricia Castellano, husband and wife, as community property. Sale price, $487,000. I read the grantor line twice. A widow. That was the legal designation. Dolores had been a widow since June 14th, 2021, and the designation was accurate. It was also the entirety of the ownership representation on the instrument. There was no co-grantor line. There was no reference to probate proceedings or a court authorization. There was no second signature block. My name did not appear anywhere on the document. I clicked through to the full scanned instrument and read it page by page. Page 1, the standard Pima County grant deed header, the property legal description, the grantor and grantee lines, as I had already noted. Page 2, the notarization block, with Dolores' signature above a notary stamp dated May 8th, 2026. The notary's name was Francie de la Cruz. Commission number AZ-2198847. Expiration September 2027. Page 3. The preliminary change of ownership report. Listing the sale price and the transfer tax calculated at the standard rate. And at the bottom, under name of real estate broker if any, Reese and Montoya Realty. License number BR-4471. I stopped on that line. My mother had worked for the Tucson Unified School District for 26 years. First as a classroom teacher, and then as an administrator. And she had retired in 2018 with the full pension and the kind of institutional farewell that involved a sheet cake from Safeway and a card signed by 47 people. She had kept those relationships. She kept all her relationships the way she kept her address book, updated annually, in ink, in the same royal blue binder she had used since before I was born. She had mentioned the name Reese and Montoya to me exactly once, approximately 3 years ago, when I had asked offhandedly whether she had thought about the house's value. And she had said, Linda Montoya sells half the homes in this zip code. Her husband was at the district for 12 years before they moved to real estate. She had said it the way she said most things about her network. As fact, as foundation, as the kind of connection she had spent a career building and expected to be recognized as valuable. Linda Montoya had been placed on the listing because she was known, because she would not call Dolores' daughter, because the transaction could happen quietly among people who trusted each other's discretion. The commission on a $487,000 sale at 5% was $24,350. That amount had been deducted from the gross proceeds before Dolores received anything. It had been paid to a brokerage selected for its familiarity, not for the best rate. I wasn't angry yet. What I felt was something more like the sensation of a floor becoming load-bearing information. I needed to stand on it carefully before I could know whether it would hold. I opened a new tab and navigated to the Pima County Superior Court probate case search. I typed, Vasquez, Roberto. The result returned immediately. Case number 2021-PR-0847, filed June 28th, 2021. 2 weeks after Roberto died, which was when I had submitted the initial paperwork. I had submitted the petition, the death certificate, and the will. I had paid the filing fee. I had done all of that correctly. What I had not done was follow through on the formal discharge of the estate. I looked at the case status field. It read, open, pending final accounting. 4 years. The case had been sitting open for 4 years because I had filed the initial petition and then returned to work and absorbed the grief into the calendar and never retained counsel to see the process through to completion. The estate of Roberto Vasquez had never been formally discharged, which meant that 4 Serrano Court had never been formally released from probate supervision, which meant that Dolores had conveyed an asset that was still, technically, under the jurisdiction of Pima County Superior Court, without petitioning the court for authorization to sell, without notifying the co-beneficiary, and without obtaining the co-beneficiary's signature on a deed of conveyance. I set my hands flat on either side of the laptop. The grant deed bore one signature. The probate case was open. The sale had closed 11 days ago, and the proceeds, half of which were mine under the terms of Roberto's will, were sitting in an account I had no access to, belonging to a woman who was by the forwarding address on the envelope, already living at 7740 East, Camelback Road, Unit 214, Scottsdale. I did the arithmetic again. $487,000 gross. Commission to Reese and Montoya. $24,350. Standard closing costs on the seller's side, which I estimated at approximately 2 to 3% of the sale price. Call it $9,000 to $14,000. Net proceeds after costs, somewhere between $448,000 and $454,000. Half of that was between $224,000 and $227,000. But the will did not specify a split of net proceeds. It specified a split of the asset itself, which the court would interpret as a split of the gross sale price unless the closing costs were court-approved and allocated. Gross split of $487,000 was $243,500. That was the number. That was what I was owed. I looked at the clock on the laptop screen. 8:51 p.m. I had eaten nothing since a granola bar at 3:30 in the afternoon. I stood up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank half of it standing at the counter, and went back to the table. The thing I kept returning to was not the number. The number was almost easier. The number was quantifiable. It was on a recorded instrument. It was mathematics. What I kept returning to was the listing. Reese and Montoya. Linda Montoya, whose husband had been at the school district for 12 years. My mother had not called a random brokerage from a Zillow advertisement. She had called someone she knew well enough to trust, with a transaction she intended to complete without my knowledge. That was not an oversight. Oversights look different. Oversights leave a phone call that didn't connect, an email sent to a wrong address, a text that said, "I've been meaning to tell you." Oversights leave traces of an attempt. There was no trace here. There had been no call, no email, no text. Not in the 3 weeks since I had last spoken to her on a Sunday. Not in the months before that. The listing had been placed. The property had been shown. An offer had been accepted. A closing date had been set. Papers had been signed. keys had been handed over and a wire transfer had been sent. And at no point during any of those steps had Dolores Vasquez picked up a phone and dialed the number for her daughter. I closed the Recorders tab. I opened my email. The contact I needed was Yvonne Ferrara at Ferrara Legal Group. I had used her once before, in 2023, for a probate research question on behalf of an attorney at Hartwell and Odom who needed a second opinion on a contested trust instrument. And she had responded to that inquiry within 4 hours and had been precise without being condescending, which was rarer than it should have been. I had her direct email address in my contacts. I started a new message. In the subject line, I typed, "Urgent, estate matter. Are you available tomorrow morning?" I stopped with the cursor in the body of the email. I looked at the time again. 11:14 p.m. I had been at the table for 2 hours without noticing the light change. The kitchen window was dark. I had the recorder's disclosure, the probate case number, the open case status, and a grant deed bearing one signature where there should have been 2 or a court order. I had the commission trail and the agent's name. What I did not yet have was the one document that would make the legal position undeniable rather than merely suggestive. The certified copy of Roberto's will with the Pima County court stamp and the case number visible. The one that named both Dolores and me as joint beneficiaries and established, in Roberto's own words, and a notary's confirmation, what he had intended for the house on Serrano Court. I knew where it was. I had put it there myself, in June of 2021, in a red fireproof box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, and I had not opened that box since. I finished typing the email to Yvonne Ferrara, hit send, and pushed back from the table. The bedroom closet in my apartment on 6th Avenue is narrow. 1 rod, 2 shelves above it. A strip of floor space where I stack the things I use less than once a year. A portable humidifier I bought during a respiratory illness in 2023 and never returned. A set of luggage my aunt gave me when I finished my associate's degree. And on the top shelf, pushed toward the back left corner behind a folded duvet. A small red metal box, approximately the size of a hardback dictionary. I bought it at the Target on Oracle Road the week after Roberto's funeral. I remember standing in the home organization aisle, in the same black dress I had worn twice that week, holding a box that cost $34.99 and was rated to withstand temperatures up to 1,550 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. The woman next to me was comparing drawer organizers. I put the red box in my cart because I was a paralegal, and the thought of estate documents sitting in a shoebox on a closet shelf, a Nike shoebox, specifically the same one Roberto had used, produced in me a specific low-grade anxiety that I did not try to explain to anyone, not even to myself. Beyond, I know what happens when these documents are needed and aren't findable. I stood on the step stool I keep on the closet floor for exactly this reason, reached to the back left corner past the duvet, and took the box down at 11:22 p.m. The combination lock uses a 3-digit code. I had set it in June 2021 to Roberto's birth year. I dialed it now without thinking. The box opened. Inside, in a manila folder, I had labelled in blue ballpoint pen in my own handwriting, Vasquez Estate /Roberto M /Case 202 1-PR-0847 was the certified copy of Roberto's will, the probate inventory I had filed with the court in the summer of 2021, and a folded receipt from the Pima County Clerk's office confirming the filing fee payment of $212. The certified copy was a 12-page document, printed on white legal paper, with the Pima County Superior Court stamp in blue ink on the bottom right corner of the first page and on the back page, and the case number handwritten in the court clerk's script in the upper right corner of page 1. 2021-PR-0847. I had read this document once before, 4 years ago, on the Thursday after Roberto died, sitting on the edge of the bed in my childhood room at 4 Serrano Court, while Dolores was on the phone in the kitchen with the funeral home. I had read it as a grieving daughter, which is to say that I had read the words but processed only a fraction of their legal content. What I had retained was the general shape. Roberto had left the property to both of us, had specified that his personal effects be divided equitably, and had expressed his wish that the house remain in the family. I had retained the emotional content and filed the legal content somewhere I did not return to. I was not reading it as a grieving daughter now. I sat down on the closet floor, the box beside me, the manila folder open in my lap, and read the certified copy of Roberto's will from page 1 to page 12. The joint beneficiary clause was on page 4, under the heading Real Property. Paragraph 3.1. The language was precise. Roberto had used an estate attorney named Frederick Sosa, whose letterhead appeared on the cover page, and Sosa had written it cleanly. The property known as 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, Arizona 85718, legally described by the assessor's parcel number listed in full, was to pass in equal and undivided shares of 50% to Dolores Esperanza Vasquez, wife of the decedent, and 50% to Petra Anissa Vasquez, daughter of the decedent, subject to the terms and conditions of this instrument and applicable Arizona probate law, equal and undivided shares. The phrase meant exactly what it said. Neither Dolores nor I held a separate, severable half of the property. We held it together, each with a 50% interest in the whole. Neither of us could convey the whole without the other. Neither of us could convey our individual interest to a third party without triggering the other's right of first refusal. And neither of us could convey the property at all without, at minimum, either the other's consent or a court order authorizing the sale. These were not interpretive points. This was the standard operation of joint tenancy under Arizona probate law, and the certified copy in my lap, stamped and numbered by Pima County Superior Court, was the instrument that established it. I turned to the probate inventory. It was a 4-page document I had prepared myself in July 2021, listing the assets of Roberto's estate. The property at 4 Serrano Court, valued at the time at approximately $310,000 based on a county assessment. Roberto's retirement accounts, which had passed outside the estate to Dolores as direct beneficiary. His vehicle, a 2016 Toyota Tundra that Dolores had kept, and his personal property. The inventory listed 4 Serrano Court under real property, with a note that the asset was subject to probate administration under the terms of the will. Subject to probate administration? I had written those words in July 2021, under Roberto's case number. What Dolores had done on May 8th, 2026, was sign a grant deed conveying a probate asset, an asset explicitly listed in the active inventory of an open probate case, without court authorization. Under Arizona law, a personal representative or heir could not simply sell a probate asset. She would have needed to either petition the court for authorization to sell and notify all interested parties, which included me, or obtain my consent as co-beneficiary in writing. She had done neither. The grant deed I had pulled from the recorder's website that evening bore her signature alone and made no reference to the probate case, no reference to a court order, and no reference to my interest. Gerald Marsh, whichever attorney Dolores eventually retained, if she retained one, would likely argue Arizona's spousal rights under interstate succession as a defense. It was the obvious argument. Dolores had been Roberto's wife for 37 years, as a surviving spouse. She had claims under state law that might appear to support her authority to act. But interstate succession was precisely the wrong framework here, because Roberto had left a will. The will superseded the interstate succession rules, and the will had placed both of us in that property jointly, which was why the probate case existed, which was why case number 2021-PR-0847 was still sitting open in the Pima County Superior Court system with a status of pending final accounting. The grant deed was not just a document that excluded my name. It was a conveyance of a probate asset by an interested party acting without court authorization, in a case that was still legally open, over an asset whose joint ownership was established in a certified instrument with a court stamp and a case number that any attorney researching the title chain would have found within 10 minutes of opening the probate file. I did not know yet whether Dolores knew all of this. What I knew was that it did not matter whether she had known it. The legal position was the same regardless of intent. I turned to the last page of the certified fill. Roberto had written on the inside of the back cover, in the black fountain pen he used for everything: receipts, birthday cards, the margins of engineering journals. A single line in his compact, precise handwriting. For Petra, the anchor stays. I had read this once before, 4 years ago, and I had assumed it was personal sentiment. He had called the house the anchor for as long as I could remember. Not the anchor of the family, just the anchor, as though it had a specific referent he expected me to understand without explanation. I had filed the phrase under the category of things Roberto said that meant more than I could decode in the immediate aftermath of grief, and I had not returned to it. I closed the certified copy. I set it on top of the manila folder on the floor beside me. If stories about women who kept the one piece of paper that everyone else forgot to keep, and what happened when they finally opened the box, are why this channel exists. A like and a subscribe is what lets the next one get told. Back to the closet on 6th Avenue. I opened the certified copy again. I turned to the back page and read Roberto's line a second time. For Petra, the anchor stays. He had written it after the will was fully executed. The notary's signature was on the preceding page, dated September 12th, 2018, and this line was written below the notary block, in the margin of the back cover, added after the legal formalities were complete, in his own hand, not as legal language, but as the kind of thing he apparently could not leave unsaid, and apparently could not say out loud either. He had believed the document would speak for itself. He had trusted the certified copy stamped by Pima County Superior Court to make the conversation unnecessary. I checked my phone. Yvonne Ferrara had replied to my 11:14 Pitakem email at 11:38 Sikim with 4 words. Yes, 9, I. Come. I typed back, confirmed. See you then? I put the phone down. I remained on the closet floor. The certified copy was in my lap, with the court stamp facing up, and the case number visible in the clerk's handwriting in the upper right corner. The lamp on the nightstand threw a thin bar of light across the threshold from the bedroom. Everything else was dim. For Serrano Court. I had not been back since the summer of 2021. I had not let myself reconstruct the rooms in detail because the rooms had belonged to a version of my family that no longer existed. And constructing them felt like opening a door I was not sure I could close. But sitting on the closet floor in the dark with my father's handwriting in my lap, I could not stop the kitchen from arriving first. The specific yellow of the late afternoon light through the window above the sink. The sound of Roberto spreading blueprints across the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. Smoothing the corners flat with both palms before he looked up. Yvonne Ferrara's office was at 2 South 6th Avenue, which was a 12-minute drive from my apartment. I had until 9 o'clock. I put the certified copy back in the manila folder, put the folder back in the fireproof box, and closed the lid. The combination lock clicked shut. I did not get up yet. The house smelled like fresh paint and something underneath the paint. Dry wood and plaster. The specific mineral smell of a new space that hasn't yet taken on the scent of the people who will live in it. I was 3 years old. I don't know how much of what I remember is real and how much was constructed from photographs I've seen since. But I've always been able to call up the feeling of being carried through the front door in Roberto's arms. The way the late afternoon light came through the living room window and made a long rectangle on the bare floor. And the way Dolores put her hand flat on the wall just inside the entryway. As if she was checking whether it was solid. It was solid. Roberto had spent 3 months inspecting it before they made an offer. He had pulled the permit history, climbed into the attic with a flashlight to check the joists, run water in every faucet in sequence to map the water pressure. He was a structural engineer. He did not buy things he hadn't examined. 4 Serrano Court was a 3-bedroom in the Catalina foothills. Built in 1967 and renovated twice before Roberto found it. Once in 1981 when the kitchen was expanded, and once in 1988 when the roof was replaced. He bought it for $147,000 in the spring of 1993, when the neighborhood was still in the process of becoming what it would later be. Quiet streets with irregular lots. Mature mesquite trees close to the property lines. Houses set back far enough from the road that you could stand on your own porch and not hear your neighbor's television. He paid 20% down. The mortgage was retired in 2019. By the time I was old enough to understand what the house was, it had already become something that felt permanent in the way that very few things do. Not just a place where we lived, but a place that organized all the other things around it. The school I went to was 4 blocks away. The parish where Dolores had been confirmed as a teenager was 6 minutes by car, and she knew every family in it. Roberto's commute to the engineering firm on Speedway was 11 minutes on a clear morning. The house was not at the center of the map. The house was the map. There are rooms I can still walk through completely in my memory, starting at the doorway and ending at the window. The kitchen first, because the kitchen was where Roberto spent his Sunday mornings. He had a ritual that I watched so many times, it became something I expected from Sunday itself. He would be up before Dolores, before me, before the neighborhood. And by the time I came downstairs at 7 or 7:30, there would be coffee already made and blueprints spread across the kitchen table. Not current projects, necessarily, but whatever he was studying or reviewing or simply thinking about. He spread them the way he spread everything, with care. The edges aligned, the corners weighted with whatever was near at hand. A coffee mug, a stapler, the sugar bowl. He would explain what I was looking at if I asked. And sometimes I asked, and sometimes I just sat beside him with my own cereal and watched him work the way children watch adults doing things that are not for them but are not forbidden either. The blueprints were how I learned the word load-bearing. Roberto had pointed to a wall in the dining room when I was maybe 7 or 8 and said that wall was load-bearing, which meant it was holding the weight of the structure above it. And I had looked at the wall and tried to see the weight it was holding. And I had not been able to. And Roberto had said, "That's the point." He said, "You build them so the weight is invisible." He never explained the finances of the house to me. I don't know that he explained them to Dolores in a systematic way either. What I know is that the mortgage statements came addressed to him, the property tax bills came addressed to him, the homeowner's insurance was in his name. And when the roof needed to be replaced in 2006, he arranged the contractor and the financing and the schedule. And Dolores was not absent from this process. She had opinions about the roofing material, and she made them known. But the paperwork was his, and the decisions that required a signature were his. And that was how it had always worked. Dolores's domain was everything else. The back patio was hers the way the kitchen table was Roberto's, which is to say it was where she did the work of maintaining the life of the house rather than the structure of it. She had built the patio garden herself over 20 years. Starting with 2 terracotta pots she bought at a nursery on Oracle Road in 1995, and ending by the time I left for the University of Arizona in 2006 with a full covered seating area, string lights along the pergola posts, and enough potted agave and prickly pear that the patio looked from the alley side like it had always been there. Like it had grown up with the desert rather than been placed against it. She used the patio for everything that mattered. Birthday dinners, Sunday lunches after Mass, the graduation parties that seemed to happen every other year as the children of her friends and former colleagues moved through high school and then college. The quinceañera she helped organize for the daughters of 3 different families on the block across a span of 8 years. I have a specific memory of being 15 and standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Dolores direct the setup for a quinceañera reception we were hosting for the daughter of her friend Marta. The chair placement, the table linens, the sequence in which the food would come out, and understanding for the first time that what I was watching was administrative competence operating at full capacity. She knew exactly where everything went. She had a list, but she had memorized the list, and the list was just backup. She did not ask Roberto for anything during that afternoon. She did not need to. The house was hers to run, and she ran it completely. That was the agreement, though neither of them ever named it to me as an agreement. Roberto handled money and paperwork. Dolores handled everything that money and paperwork were in service of. It had worked for 37 years because it was a reasonable division, and because neither of them had ever been in a situation where the two domains needed to be reconciled in front of a third party. Roberto died on June 14th, 2021. He had been admitted to Banner University Medical Center 6 days earlier after a myocardial infarction during a Sunday morning walk in the neighborhood. He had made it back to the house, which Dolores had always said was characteristic of him, that he would finish the walk rather than sit down where he was. And he had spent those 6 days declining in the cardiac ICU with the specific, terrible patience of a man who had calculated the structural load and understood that the numbers were not in his favor. He died at 11:49 in the morning, with Dolores on his left side and me on his right. 3 days later, I found the will. I had been staying in my childhood bedroom, sleeping in the bed I had slept in from age 9 until I left for college, and I had been trying to be useful in the way that grieving people try to be useful as a substitute for being present. Cleaning out the refrigerator, accepting food from neighbors, driving Dolores to the funeral home for the arrangement meeting. On the third day, a Thursday, still June, the heat already past 90/10 in the morning, I went looking for the title documents for Roberto's truck because the insurance company had called about the vehicle policy, and I was the one who had answered the phone, and I did not know where anything was. I looked in the drawer of Roberto's desk first, then the filing cabinet in the second bedroom he had used as an office. Then I went to the hallway closet, the one near the front door where Dolores kept extra blankets and the good tablecloths in a cedar chest, and Roberto kept a collection of things he did not use often enough to store in the office but did not want in the attic, and a battery-powered radio, a folded map of Pima County from 1998, a Nike shoebox on the top shelf. I stood on the step stool and brought the shoebox down. Inside was the original will in a sealed envelope from Frederick Sosa. Attorney at law, the deed to the house, dated 1993, the paid-off mortgage documents from 2019 in a rubber-banded set, the title documents for the Tundra, and a smaller envelope I did not open that turned out, when Dolores identified it later, to contain the original marriage certificate. I found the truck documents and called the insurance company back, and then I sat with the will for a long time before I opened it. I read it once. I understood the general shape. Roberto had left the property to both of us, had specified his personal effects be divided equitably, had expressed his wish that the house remain in the family. I filed the will with the county. I paid the filing fee. I prepared the probate inventory. I did all of this carefully because I was a paralegal, and careful was what I defaulted to under pressure. And then I went back to Tucson, and then I went back to work, and I did not return to 4 Serrano Court after the summer of 2021. I had understood, on some level, that the fault line between Roberto's domain and Dolores's domain did not stop operating just because Roberto was gone. That the habits of 37 years do not reorganize themselves on receipt of a death certificate. That a woman who had managed every dimension of domestic life for nearly 4 decades, and who had never once had a decision about her own house questioned or overruled, would continue to experience that house as hers to manage. I had understood this and decided it was not my place to intervene, and that decision had a cost I had not fully calculated. The morning I was heading to Ferrara Legal Group with a certified will copy in my bag. I would find out whether the cost could be recovered and whether the probate case that had been sitting open for 4 years was still the legal instrument it needed to be. Ferrara Legal Group occupied the second floor of a building on South 6th Avenue that had been a dental office in a previous life. The waiting area still had the drop ceiling and the particular quality of quiet that comes from rooms designed to muffle sound. I arrived at 8:52 a.m. with the manila folder from the fireproof box under my arm and had been seated in the conference room. A small rectangle with a laminate table and 2 windows facing the parking structure, for 4 minutes before Yvonne Ferrara came in. She was 44 and carried the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to read people's documents before she read their faces. She shook my hand, set a yellow legal pad at her place across the table, and said, "Show me what you have." I laid out the manila folder and opened it. The certified will copy, the probate inventory, and the county recorder's disclosure I had printed at home at 7 that morning. 3 documents in order. She read the certified will first. She read the way attorneys read, which is the way I read when I'm doing title work. Not start to finish, but targeted, grantor and grantee lines, real property clauses, beneficiary designations, execution date, notary block. She turned to page 4, read paragraph 3.1, turned to the back page, read the court stamp and the case number. She set the will down. She read the probate inventory. She paused on the line that listed 4 Serrano Court under real property. Subject to probate administration. She read the recorder's disclosure. She looked at the grantor line, Dolores Esperanza Vasquez, a widow, and then at the recording date. And then she set the disclosure face down on the table and looked at me. "When did you receive the mail that told you this had happened?" "Yesterday afternoon," I said, "May 19th. "Closing date on the instrument is May 8th. "Yes." "Case 2021-PR-0847 is still open?" "Still open. I checked the Superior Court portal at 11 o'clock last night. Status reads, open, pending final accounting." She wrote something on the legal pad. Then she said, "This is not a paperwork error." She said it the way I say certain things to attorneys at Hartwell and Odom when I have finished the title research, and the news is not good. Not as judgment, not as condemnation, just as a classification. This is what the documents show. This is the category it falls into. I asked her to explain exactly what that meant in terms of the path forward. And she said the estate of Roberto Vasquez was never formally discharged. The case has been open since June 2021. Under Arizona law, a probate asset and 4 Serrano Court was explicitly listed as a probate asset in the inventory, as I had correctly identified, cannot be sold by an interested party without either the consent of all beneficiaries or authorization from the probate court. A grant deed signed solely by one beneficiary, with no reference to a co-beneficiary's consent and no court order authorizing the sale, was a conveyance made without legal authority. Her position, Yvonne said, will be that, as the surviving spouse, she had the right to manage the estate. Arizona is a community property state, but he left a will, which is exactly what her attorney will have to contend with. The will supersedes interstate succession rights for the specific assets it names. She named both of you as joint beneficiaries on the real property, the moment she signed that deed without your consent. She conveyed something she did not have the unilateral legal authority to convey. Yvonne paused. Do you have anything that documents when she started managing the mail from the property? I had been waiting for this. I took out my phone and pulled up the photos I had taken the night before. Close-up images of the Capital One pre-screen envelope and its 3 forwarding labels. Each label photographed separately and in sequence. And then a wide shot showing all 3 stacked against the white of the envelope face. I set the phone on the table and turned it to face her. Yvonne picked it up. She looked at the photos in sequence, zooming in on each label. The first label, Petra Vasquez, 6th Avenue address, forwarded from 4 Serrano Court. The second label, D. Vasquez, 7740E. Camelback Road, Unit 214, Scottsdale. The third label, Petra Vasquez, care of Hartwell and Odom, LLP. 220E, Congress Street. The postal system sent this to the Scottsdale address first, she said. The bottom label? Yes! Which means the USPS had the Scottsdale address on file as the forwarding destination from 4 Serrano Court before the mail landed there. That's my read. Someone had to submit a mail forwarding request, listing the Camelback Road address as the redirect for mail addressed to Serrano Court. That request would have been submitted to the post office. Yvonne set the phone down. She wrote 3 lines on the legal pad. A USPS mail forwarding request requires a signature and a submission date. The Postal Service keeps those records. She looked at me. You work in a legal environment. You know what a signed mail forwarding request with a date on it does to the characterization of this transaction. I did. A signed request submitted to the post office before the May 8th closing date would show that Dolores had been actively arranging to redirect mail from 4 Serrano Court to the Scottsdale address in advance of the sale, which meant she had been preparing for a transition that she had not disclosed to me. It shifted the question from whether she had understood that I had an interest in the property to whether she had taken deliberate steps to ensure the transaction completed without my knowledge. I'll photograph the label chain and document it formally, Yvonne said. We can request the forwarding submission records from USPS under a subpoena if it comes to that. I asked her then about the worst case, not the legal position. I understood the legal position well enough. I asked about the money. Yvonne leaned back slightly in her chair. She said, What do you know about her current living situation? I told her what I knew. The Scottsdale address, Rolando Mira, the condo purchase he had been facilitating. I told her about the Sunday phone call in February where Dolores had mentioned Scottsdale, and about the conversation 3 weeks ago where she had said she was thinking about what made sense for the house. Yvonne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, If the proceeds from a $487,000 sale, net approximately $448,000 after commission and closing costs, have been partially or entirely committed to a real estate purchase in Scottsdale, and if that purchase has already closed or is in escrow, then recovering your share becomes significantly more complicated. a lis pendens freezes what it can reach. If the money has already moved into an illiquid asset in another party's name, we're looking at a different set of remedies. I did not say anything. She had been talking about my $243,500. The gross 50% split. The number that appeared in the will. As a recoverable figure. She was now describing a scenario in which it might already be encased in a Scottsdale condominium purchase belonging to Rolando Mira, who was not a party to any probate proceeding and had no obligation to undo a transaction he had no legal knowledge was tainted. I looked at the certified will copy on the table. Page 4, paragraph 3.1, equal and undivided shares. Roberto Vasquez's signature on the execution page. Witnessed, notarized, stamped by Pima County Superior Court. What's the window? I said. Yvonne looked at her legal pad. If the proceeds are still liquid, still in your mother's account, or in an account she controls, we can file a motion to freeze under the open probate case. The case number gives a standing. I'd need to move quickly. She looked up. We have 11 days from the closing date before the standard residential escrow settlement period makes tracing significantly harder. The closing was May 8th. Today is May 20th. 11 days. From May 8th, 11 days out was May 19th. Today was May 20th. We were one day past the window she had just named. I said, you said 11 days from the closing date. Today is May 20th. I said 11 days makes it significantly harder. Yvonne said, not impossible. If the proceeds are still in a liquid account, I can file a motion to freeze under 2021-PR-0847 today. The court can grant a temporary hold within 72 hours if the filing is clean and the standing is clear. She tapped the certified will copy. This is clean. The standing is clear. She picked up the certified copy and turned to the back page. She read Roberto's handwritten line without commenting on it. She set the copy down. Do you want to proceed? She said. The question had a specific weight to it. Yvonne Ferrara was 44 years old and had been in probate and estate law for 17 years, and she had just described the legal position to me with complete precision and without softening any of it. And she was now asking whether I wanted to proceed, which was not a question about whether I had the legal right to proceed. I did, but whether I was prepared for what proceeding would involve. I was not angry yet. What I felt was more like the sensation I get when I finish a title search and find the defect that everyone else missed, a kind of cold alertness, an orientation toward the problem rather than away from it. The grief, if it was coming, was behind me somewhere. In front of me was a specific document, a specific number, a specific window, and a specific attorney who had just told me the window had not fully closed. Yes, I said. Then I need you to leave the certified will copy and the probate inventory with me today. I'll make copies and return the originals within 24 hours. And I need a photo of those envelope labels in higher resolution. Can you send them to my office email before you leave the building? I said I could. She said, I'll have the motion drafted by end of day. The question of whether the proceeds are still liquid is something we won't know until after the filing. But the filing establishes our position in the record. She paused. One more thing. Before I file, I'd like to know whether you've spoken to your mother about this. Not yet. Do you intend to? I intend to call her today. Yvonne nodded once. Call her before I file. Not to give her an opportunity to move the money. The filing will happen regardless of the conversation. But if she offers any information about where the proceeds currently sit, that's information I can use. She looked at me. Keep the call short. Ask one question and listen to the answer. Don't tell her what documents you have. I gathered the recorder's disclosure and put it back in the folder. The certified will copy and the probate inventory I left on the table, as she had asked. I stood up, shook her hand, and walked out through the reception area, past the drop ceiling and the particular quiet that the building had kept from its previous life, and took the elevator down to the parking structure. My car was on the second level, a grey Honda Accord I had bought used in 2022. I sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine off and looked at my phone. I had Dolores's number in my contacts under the name she had always been in my contacts. Mom, Yvonne had said, ask one question and listen to the answer. I dialed at 11:47 a.m. and waited for it to connect. Dolores answered on the second ring. Petra! Not a greeting, a placement. The single word she used when she was already in the middle of something, and my call had landed in the margins of it. I was sitting in the grey Accord on the second level of the parking structure on 6th Avenue. The engine off. The manila folder on the passenger seat. The structure was mostly empty at this hour. Someone 3 spaces down had left their hazards blinking. Through the concrete half wall, I could see a strip of Tucson sky, the colour of old paper. Mom, I said, I need to ask you about 4 Serrano Court. A pause. What about it? I received mail at my office this week that was forwarded from the Serrano Court address. It was addressed to a David Castellano. The return label had your Scottsdale address on it. I kept my voice level. Can you tell me when you sold the house? A longer pause. When she spoke again, the word came out with a kind of brisk bewilderment, as if she was correcting a misunderstanding that should not have required correcting. What are you talking about? You weren't even on the deed. I had known this was coming. I had known the shape of this argument before I dialed. She believed it. That was the thing I kept returning to. She was not saying it as a deflection. She was saying it as a fact she had constructed in good faith and lived inside for 4 years without anyone pushing back on it. Roberto's name had been on the deed. Roberto had handled the paperwork. Roberto was gone. She was his wife. Therefore, the house was hers to manage. The logic was internally consistent in the way that logic built from habit tends to be. The deed is a different instrument from the will, I said. Dad's will named both of us as joint beneficiaries on the real property. Another pause. I know what the will says. Her voice had changed register. Not quite defensive, not quite certain. Your father and I made those decisions together. He wanted to provide for both of us. Do you know if the probate case was ever formally closed? The lawyer handled it. Which lawyer? A beat. Frederick Sosa handled your father's estate. Frederick Sosa, whose name was on the cover page of the certified will copy, currently sitting in Yvonne Ferrara's office. I had not heard his name since the summer of 2021. Did you ever receive a final discharge order from Pima County Superior Court? A document that said the estate was formally closed? Petra, I managed that house for 30 years. Her voice had shifted again, lower, fuller, entering the register I recognized as the one she used when she was about to explain something she believed the other person had failed to understand. I kept it up. I paid the taxes. I arranged every repair after your father was gone, and couldn't do it himself. When the roof started showing wear on the east side last summer, I had 3 contractors out there to look at it. I thought I was just handling things the way I always handle things. She paused. I did not fill the silence. I didn't think I needed your permission to make a decision about my own home. She said my own home the way she always said it. Not as a legal claim, but as something so self-evident it embarrassed her to have to state it. I kept that house for 30 years. I thought I was just handling things. I had one question left for this register. Where are the proceeds from the sale currently? A short silence. Rolando and I are in the process of finalizing a purchase here in Scottsdale. Has that transaction closed? That's none of your... She stopped. Started again. We are in the final stages. I don't see what that has to do with anything. I need to know whether the proceeds from 4 Serrano Court have been transferred or committed to another purchase. Petra! Now the voice was flat and cold and completely certain. This was the 3rd register. Not confusion, not justification, conclusion. You're going to drag your own mother into court over a house you haven't visited in 2 years. I did not respond to that. She waited for me to respond. When I didn't, she continued. You couldn't be bothered to come back. Not once. In 4 years. I was alone in that house after your father died, and you came for the summer, and then you left. And then it was phone calls, and then it was less phone calls. And now you want to tell me I didn't have the right to make a decision about a piece of property that I maintained alone. Without you, while you were in Tucson doing whatever you were doing. Her voice had tightened around something I could not name and did not intend to name. I am 62 years old. I have a right to decide what comes next for my own life. I said, who was the escrow company? She did not answer. Mom, I'm asking about the transaction specifically. If the proceeds are in escrow, I need to know which company is holding them. I'm not going to. This is not a deposition, Petra. I know. I waited. You're treating me like a witness. The anger in her voice had thinned into something else. Not hurt, exactly, but the particular flattened quality of someone who has realized the conversation is no longer the kind they can control with the tools they have. I raised you in that house. I know, I said. I ended the call. The Scottsdale transaction had not closed. That was the only specific thing she had confirmed, though not in words she had meant as confirmation. She had said, in the final stages, which meant the Scottsdale purchase was in escrow, which meant the proceeds from 4 Serrano Court had likely been committed as earnest money or partial payment, but had not fully transferred. Which meant Yvonne Ferrara still had a window. If you have stayed with this story this long, a daughter and a mother and a certified will that sat in a red fireproof box for 4 years, waiting to matter. A like and a subscribe is what lets the next one reach the people who need it. The Accord's engine turned over on the first try. I drove back to Hartwell and Odom on autopilot. The way you drive a route you have taken hundreds of times. I parked in the garage on Council Street and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Hartwell and Odom front desk addressed to me from Marsh and Associates. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, May 23rd, 3 days after the call to Dolores. Talia brought it to my desk at 9:17 a.m. on a firm envelope with Marsh and Associates printed in the upper left corner and my name typed on the address line. Not the firm's name, my name, which meant someone had made a point of researching where I worked. I read it at my desk. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, on letterhead that listed a 4th Avenue address and 3 attorneys below Gerald Marsh's name. The argument occupied the first page and a half and ran as follows. Petra Vasquez's claimed interest in the proceeds of the sale of 4 Serrano Court lacked legal merit because the property deed at the time of Roberto Vasquez's death on June 14th, 2021 was titled solely in Roberto Vasquez's name. Under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 14-2-102, governing interstate succession rights of a surviving spouse. Dolores Vasquez held full authority as Roberto's surviving spouse to manage and convey community property, and therefore the grant deed executed on May 8th, 2026 was valid, proper, and not subject to challenge by a third party. The letter concluded by requesting that I withdraw any claims and refrain from further legal action that would only result in unnecessary expense and family distress. The phrase third party sat there on the page. I had been reduced to a third party in a transaction involving my father's house. I photographed both pages on my phone and sent them to Yvonne Ferrara at 9:22 p.m. with a single line, Marsh and Associates responding on Dolores's behalf. See attached. Yvonne called at 9:39 a.m. He hasn't pulled the probate file, she said. She said it the way I had said third party to myself 30 seconds ago, not with heat, just as an observation about a specific failure. He's arguing interstate succession. The will supersedes interstate succession. If he had pulled case number 2021-PR-0847 from the Pima County Superior Court system, he would know that. I asked her whether this changed anything on our end. It confirms he's working from the deed record, not from the probate record, she said. That's a thin position. When I file the motion under the open probate case, he'll have to pull the file to respond to it. And when he does, he'll find exactly what we already know is in it. A pause. I'm filing today. I asked her about the timing, whether Dolores would be notified before the court acted. She'll be served after the filing, before the court rules. Standard procedure. If the proceeds are liquid, the court can grant a temporary freeze within 72 hours. Yvonne paused again. Is there anything else I should know before I submit? There was not. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at my desk for another 4 minutes, and then I opened the Marchetti title file and went back to work. Because there was nothing else to do yet. And because the work was there. And because sitting with the Marsh letter face up on my desk was not going to change what it said. At 2:14 p.m., I called Dolores. It rang once. Then her voicemail recording. the one she had used for years, her voice saying she was unable to take the call and to leave a message. I did not leave one. I set my phone face down on the desk the way I always did when I was trying to concentrate and went back to the title search. At 2:34 p.m., 20 minutes and 11 seconds after I had called, according to the recent calls log I checked later. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from a number I did not have in my contacts. The area code was 602. Scottsdale! The text read, "Your mother is very upset. Please think about what this family has been through before you do something you can't undo." I read it twice. Then I pulled up the number in a reverse lookup app I had on my phone from a case at Hartwell and Odom 2 years ago that required locating a witness. The number was registered to Rolando Mira. I had met Rolando Mira once. At Christmas of 2024, he had driven Dolores to the dinner we had at my cousin's house in Morena, and he had spent the evening talking with the men near the food and had shaken my hand when he arrived. And when he left, I had formed no particular impression of him. He was 65, retired, a contractor. He had been courteous. He had said my name correctly. That was the totality of what I knew about him from experience, as opposed to what I had since inferred from the sale of a house he had nothing to do with, and a Scottsdale condo purchase he was facilitating with proceeds that were not fully his partner's to use. This family! He had been in the room for one Christmas dinner. I did not respond to the text. I put my phone in my bag. Talia appeared in my office doorway at 4:45 p.m. with a look I recognized. The one she used when she had already formed an opinion and was deciding whether to say it out loud. "Do you want to talk about the Marsh letter?" she said. "No." She nodded. "Okay." She stayed in the doorway for a moment longer. For what it's worth, his argument about interstate succession is sloppy. If there's a will, you lead with the will. I know. So he either doesn't have the will or he doesn't have the probate file. Yvonne said the same thing. Talia looked at me for another second. Then she said, "Go home at a reasonable hour," and left. I left at 6:30. I made dinner and did not eat much of it, and washed the dishes, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop at 9:48 p.m. Yvonne had emailed at 6:02 p.m. to confirm the motion had been filed under case number 2021-PR-0847. She would notify me when the court responded. I pulled the fireproof box from the closet and set it on the table beside the laptop. I opened it. I took out the certified will copy and set it under my right palm without opening it. The court stamp was on the back page, visible through the top sheet at the corner. The case number was in the clerk's handwriting, small and even, in the upper right corner of the cover page. The text from Rolando Mira's 602 number was still sitting in my phone, unanswered. I had not decided what to do with it. There were several options, each with different downstream effects. I could respond and say nothing useful. I could forward it to Yvonne as documentation that a non-party was attempting to apply pressure to an active legal matter. I could ignore it entirely, which was also a choice. The desk lamp made a small circle on the table. The house was quiet. The certified will was under my palm. The court stamp at the corner. And I had not yet decided whether to answer. What I knew, at midnight, at my kitchen table, was that the motion was filed, The probate case number was in the record, and Gerald Marsh was going to pull that file within 48 hours of being served. And when he did, his interstate succession argument was going to require significant revision. The Scottsdale escrow was, as Dolores had said, in its final stages. Yvonne's motion to freeze the proceeds would reach the court before it closed, or it would not. That outcome was no longer within my control to effect. What I was about to find out was whether the court would act in time. Yvonne Ferrara filed the motion on the afternoon of May 23rd, under case number 2021-PR-0847, citing the unauthorized conveyance of a probate asset by an interested party without court authorization and without the co-beneficiary's consent. The motion requested a temporary freeze on the proceeds from the sale of 4 Serrano Court pending a hearing, and it attached 3 exhibits: a certified copy of Roberto's will, the probate inventory showing the property as an active estate asset, and the closing disclosure from the Pima County Recorder confirming the May 8th transfer. The court granted the temporary hold on May 26th. The notice went to Dolores's address of record, the Scottsdale unit on Camelback Road, and, by operation of law, to her attorney of record, Gerald Marsh. Gerald Marsh pulled the full probate file on May 27th. His second letter arrived at Hartwell and Odom on May 28th. It was 1 page this time. The interstate succession argument was gone. The new letter requested a settlement conference at a mutually agreeable location at the earliest available date, and it described the purpose of the meeting as resolving the outstanding questions related to case number Pioneer 2021-PR-0847 and the proceeds of the sale of the real property located at 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, Arizona. Outstanding questions! That was how it looked. Once he had read the file, Yvonne and I agreed on Ferrara Legal Group's conference room. The date was a Tuesday morning, June 10th at 10 o'clock. I drove myself and parked on 6th Avenue and arrived 12 minutes early. Yvonne was already at the table with a yellow legal pad and the 3 documents arranged in front of her place. The certified will copy on top, the 3-label envelope photograph printed in colour on standard paper in the middle, and the probate inventory on the bottom. She had placed them face down. I sat to her right and set my bag on the chair beside me and did not take anything to route. They arrived at 10:04. Gerald Marsh came in first. He was 54, heavier than his law firm's website photograph suggested, and he carried a legal-size portfolio that he set on the table without opening it. Dolores came in behind him. She was wearing a grey linen blazer I recognized from 3 years ago, and she sat down directly across from me and looked at Gerald's portfolio, and then at the face-down documents in front of Yvonne, and then at the window. She did not look at me. The conference room had 4 windows facing the parking structure. The morning light came in flat and even. The table was laminate, the same table from my first meeting with Yvonne, and the chairs were padded task chairs in a neutral grey. There was a water pitcher in the centre. Nobody touched it. Gerald opened a folder from his portfolio and cleared his throat. He said that his client had authorized him to present a structured resolution to avoid the expense and delay of a full probate hearing, and that the offer reflected his client's genuine recognition of Petra's equitable interest in the sale proceeds, and that he believed the number represented a fair accounting given the circumstances. The number he said was $180,000. He framed it as a good faith offer and said his client remained open to reasonable discussion. He spoke for approximately 3 minutes. When he finished, he set a single-page document on the table, the written offer, I assumed, though I did not pick it up to confirm. I looked at Dolores. She was looking at the table. Yvonne did not say anything for 3 seconds. Then she reached forward and turned the 3 documents face up. One at a time. In order, the certified will copy first. Open to page 4 and paragraph 3.1. The colour photograph of the Capital One pre-screen envelope with all 3 forwarding labels visible in sequence. And the probate inventory, open to the line that listed 4 Serrano Court as a probate asset subject to administration. She placed them in a row in the centre of the table where everyone could see them, and then she set her hands flat on the table and said nothing. The room was quiet. It stayed quiet for 11 seconds. I know because I counted. Gerald looked at the photograph of the 3 forwarding labels for a long moment. Then he looked at the certified will copy at paragraph 3.1. He looked at Yvonne. He looked at his own portfolio. Dolores was looking at the photograph, specifically at the middle label, the one addressed to D. Vasquez at 7740E Camelback Road, Unit 214. The label she had submitted to the post office before the closing. She did not say anything. This was the first time in the story that she was the person in a room who had to explain what had happened, rather than the person who had decided what would happen. She did not explain. She looked at the middle label and was quiet. And whatever she was feeling in that moment, I do not know. Because I was watching her hands on the table, and they were still. And she did not look at me. And after a moment, she looked at Gerald instead. Gerald said, "We acknowledge that the picture is more complex than our initial letter indicated." Yvonne said, "The probate case has been open since June 2021. The sale was executed without court authorization and without the co-beneficiary's consent. The question before us is not the characterization of the interest. The question is the amount. We've offered $180,000. The will specifies an equal and undivided 50% share of the real property." Yvonne said, "The sale price was $487,000. 50% of the gross sale price is $243,500. The offer on the table is 68 cents on the dollar." Gerald said, "There are costs associated with the sale. Commission, closing costs." The commission was paid to Reese and Montoya Realty, a brokerage selected by your client through a personal connection. Yvonne said, "The co-beneficiary did not consent to the listing arrangement, the commission rate, or the agent selection. Those costs are not legitimately deducted from the co-beneficiary's gross share without her prior agreement." Gerald looked at his portfolio. He wrote something on a notepad I could not read from across the table. He said, "My client has obligations related to a separate real estate transaction that creates some constraint on the available liquidity. That transaction was entered into using proceeds that include funds the court has now temporarily frozen." Yvonne said, "The constraint is the result of the sequence of decisions your client had." Dolores looked up from the table. She looked at Gerald. Something passed between them that I could not fully read. She said something to him under her breath, too low for me to catch the words. And Gerald nodded once. I addressed Dolores directly at that point. Not Gerald, not the table. Mom! She looked at me for the first time since she had walked into the room. 17 minutes had passed. The number in the will is $243,500, I said. I'm not negotiating the number. She did not look away. She was 62 years old, and she was sitting across from me in a conference room in Tucson with 3 documents laid out on a laminate table, and none of what she believed she had been entitled to do was visible in those 3 documents. What was visible was a grant deed signed without court authorization, a mail forwarding request submitted before the closing, and paragraph 3.1 of a will drafted by Frederick Sosa and stamped by Pima County Superior Court 8 years ago. She said, "I'm not trying to take something from you." I did not argue with that. I waited. She said, "I thought I was handling my own house." I know. A silence. "Gerald," she said. He wrote something else on his notepad. A different note this time, and slid it toward her. She read it. She looked at the 3 documents on the table, and then back at him. Then she nodded. Gerald said to Yvonne, "My client is prepared to accept the $243,500 figure subject to a mutual release and an agreed-upon timeline for disbursement." "There's one additional term," I said. Gerald looked at me. I had drafted the clause myself, the night before, at my kitchen table using the same legal pad I kept for work. It was 1 paragraph. It specified that Dolores Vasquez, as part of the settlement agreement in case number 2021-PR-0847, would provide a signed written letter acknowledging the handwritten notation made by Roberto Vasquez on the reverse cover of his will. Dated September 2018, reading, "For Petra, the anchor stays." The letter was to confirm that Roberto had written the note in his own hand, addressed it to Petra, and intended by it a statement of his wish regarding his daughter's relationship to the property. The letter required no legal consequences and imposed no additional obligation. It was 1 paragraph. It required a signature. I read the clause aloud from the legal pad. Gerald said, "That's unusual." It's 1 paragraph. He looked at Dolores. She was looking at the legal pad in my hands. "Roberto wrote it," I said to her, not to Gerald. "He wrote it after the will was executed, after the notary left. He wrote it on the back cover, and it was still there when I found the box in 2021. He wrote it because he wanted me to read it." I set the legal pad down. He believed the document would speak for itself. "I want the document to have a witness." Dolores was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know he wrote it." I waited. "He showed it to me," she said. "He said he wanted you to know the house was always going to be yours too, that he was worried you thought." She stopped. She looked at the window. "He worried you thought we saw the house as ours, and you as a visitor in it." She had not said this before. She had not said any of this before. There was no room in any of our phone calls in the last 4 years, or in the 3 weeks of silence before the envelope arrived, for her to have said it, and I did not know whether that was my failure or hers, or simply the accumulated weight of 2 people who had built their grief around the same person in separate rooms, and never compared the architecture. "I did not say anything." She looked at Gerald and said, Add the paragraph. Yvonne drafted the term sheet in 40 minutes, working from a template she had prepared in advance. She printed 2 copies and bait-stamped both sets. Pages 001 through 004 on the first copy, 005 through 008 on the second, and both copies were signed by Dolores and Gerald Marsh on one side and by me and Yvonne on the other. And both signatures were witnessed by Yvonne's paralegal, a young woman named Sophia, who came in from the reception area with a notary stamp and did not ask any questions. The margin note acknowledgement clause was on page 3 of the term sheet, paragraph 6, just above the signature block. Gerald took his copy and put it in his portfolio and stood and shook Yvonne's hand. And then, briefly, mine. Dolores stood. She picked up her handbag from the chair beside her. She looked at the table for a moment, at the 3 documents still lying face up in the centre, the certified will copy on top, the case number visible in the upper right corner, and then she walked to the door without looking back. Yvonne set her copy of the signed term sheet in her own folder. She capped her pen. She looked at me. Wire transfer typically clears in 30 to 31 business days from the signed agreement, she said. 31 days was July 11th. I wrote the date on the legal pad. The notification arrived at 9:12 on a Wednesday, July 11th, 2026. A text from my bank, wire transfer received. $243,500. See account for details. I was standing in the kitchen in the apartment on 6th Avenue with a cup of coffee I had not yet touched. The morning light came through the double-paned windows the way it always did at this hour, flat and without shadow. I read the notification twice. Then I set my phone face up on the counter and drank the coffee. No call came from Dolores. No text. No email. The wire transferred, and the day continued. I had not expected a call. I had known from the moment Dolores walked out of Yvonne Ferrara's conference room without looking back that the relationship we had after that day would be defined by the settlement agreement and not by anything warmer. That was not a punishment I had intended. It was simply the shape of what remained after the thing that had been done was acknowledged in writing, and a number was attached to it. Some things, once formalized, cannot be informalized. The term sheet had 3 signatures on it. It was filed in case number 2021-PR-0847. Yvonne had sent me a copy of the filed settlement agreement the previous week. It was 9 pages. Bait-stamped 001 through 009, with exhibits attached beginning at page 10. Exhibit A was the Capital One pre-screen credit offer for David Castellano, or current resident. Originally addressed to 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, A's 85718 with 3 USPS forwarding labels photographed in sequence, the bottom label showing the Scottsdale address, the middle label showing my 6th Avenue apartment, the top label showing Hartwell and Odom's address on East, Congress, colour printed, bait stamped, 010, and formally entered into the record of an open probate estate in Pima County Superior Court. Dolores had not been able to predict that envelope. She had not been able to intercept it. The Capital One pre-screen algorithm had done what pre-screen algorithms do. It had found a new credit file at an address and generated an offer addressed to the person most recently associated with it. The 3-label chain was the postal system's record of everywhere the envelope had traveled before it found me. And it was now Exhibit A, in a filed legal document that would sit in the Pima County Superior Court archive for as long as the court maintained records. Roberto's case number was on the cover page of the settlement agreement. It was on the probate inventory. It was on the certified will copy. It had been there since June of 2021, when I had filed the initial petition with a $212 filing fee, and then returned to work and not followed through on the discharge. The case number had been the instrument the whole time. I had put it in a red fireproof box in 2021 and set it on a shelf, and it had waited. The signed letter from Dolores arrived by standard mail on the following Monday. July 14th, the envelope had her return address printed on a white label. 7740 East. Camelback Road, Unit 214, Scottsdale, and inside it was a single page, folded in thirds. The page was typed and centered on the paper, which was plain white printer paper, not letterhead. It read, I, Dolores Esperanza Vasquez, acknowledge that the handwritten notation on the inside back cover of the last will and testament of Roberto Manuel Vasquez, executed September 12th, 2018, reading, For Petra, the anchor stays, was written in Roberto Vasquez's own hand, was addressed by him to Petra Anissa Vasquez, and expressed his intention that his daughter maintain an equal and enduring connection to the family property located at 4 Serrano Court, Tucson, Arizona. Below that was her signature, in blue ink, and the date, July 12th, 2026. One paragraph. No additional words. No Dear Petra at the top. No closing. Just the acknowledgement and the signature and the date, which meant she had signed it the day after the wire cleared and mailed it immediately. I read it once. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. She had written nothing beyond what the term sheet required. That was her right. The term sheet required one paragraph and a signature, and that was what she had sent. And the document was now complete. Before the fireproof box goes back on the shelf, if stories about women who held onto the one piece of paper nobody else remembered to keep are why this channel matters, a like and a subscribe is how the next one reaches the people looking for it. The settlement agreement was open on the table beside the letter. I went to the bedroom closet. I took the red fireproof box down from the top shelf with the step stool. I dialed the combination, Roberto's birth year, and opened it. Inside, the certified will copy was still in the manila folder labeled Vasquez Estate /Roberto M/case 2021-PR-0847, the Pima County Court stamp on the back cover. The case number in the clerk's handwriting in the upper right corner of page 1. I took the settlement agreement, 9 pages plus exhibits, the full filed copy with the court's receipt stamp on page 1, and placed it in the folder beside the certified will copy. The two documents together were approximately an inch thick. They fit without needing to be refolded. I closed the manila folder. I picked up Dolores' signed letter from the table and read it one more time. For Petra, the anchor stays. Roberto had written it in September 2018, 3 years before he died, in the black fountain pen he used for everything. He had written it after the notary left. He had written it because he was a structural engineer, and he believed a precisely written instrument made the conversation unnecessary. And he had been wrong about that, and the letter Dolores had just signed was the conversation he had believed the instrument would replace. I put the letter inside the folder with the other documents. I closed the fireproof box and locked it. The combination clicked shut. I climbed back up on the step stool and put the box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, in the back left corner behind the folded duvet, where I had kept it since 2021. The shelf held it. It had always held it. Roberto had not left me the house. He had left me the certified copy with the court stamp, the probate case number, and the habit of keeping the box locked. For 28 years, he had managed the paperwork of his family's life so quietly that no one had thought to ask where it was or what it meant. He had believed the precision of the instrument would protect what he intended. What he had not anticipated was that the instrument needed someone to pick it up. He had left me exactly the tools for that. I stepped down from the stool and put it back on the closet floor and closed the closet door. Petra kept the fireproof box not because she had anticipated needing it, but because she was a paralegal and loose estate documents produced in her a specific professional unease she had never fully explained to anyone. That reflex, which she had always treated as a minor quirk rather than a meaningful decision, turned out to be the single act that made every subsequent act possible. Documentation is not paranoia. It is the only language that survives grief with its precision intact. The certified copy with the court stamp. The probate case number obtained in June 2021. The manila folder labelled in her own handwriting. None of these required foresight. They required only that she did the ordinary work of her profession in the weeks after her father died, and did not stop. Roberto wrote, "For Petra." The anchor stays on the inside back cover of the will after the notary had already left the room. He wrote it as a private message, not a legal instrument, and it sat in a Nike shoebox for 3 years before Petra found it. And in the red fireproof box for 4 more years after that. I read once and filed when the settlement agreement was executed and entered into the record of case number 2021-PR-0847. Dolores' signed acknowledgement of the note was attached as a required term. Not as punishment, but because Roberto had written it to be read. And a statement written to be read is not finished until it has a witness. The note was never the problem. The problem was that it had been sitting in a box with a combination lock, waiting for the paperwork to catch up to what it already meant.